Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 16a. We're going to be talking about minimizing your risk for developing type 2 diabetes. We're going to talk about the trends for diabetes in the United States and globally. We're going to discuss symptoms associated with diabetes and diagnosis of diabetes. And we're going to explain how to prevent and treat diabetes. In the world, there are around 422 million people who are classified as diabetic. Over half of all adult diabetes occurs in China, India, the United States, Brazil, and Indonesia. The Center for Disease Control, the CDC, estimates that diabetes affects at least 10% of the US population. It's much higher in parts of the country. Incidence of diabetes is associated with socioeconomic burdens, and it continues to increase every year. Diabetes kills more Americans every year than breast cancer and HIV. So yeah, let's take a look at the number of people in the United States who are diagnosed with diabetes. This is showing the trend from 1958 through 2015. And you can see that there's this dramatic increase in the number of people with diabetes and the percentage of people with diabetes in the United States of America. So that is climbing to the point where 7 to 8% of the population have frank diagnosis of diabetes, and more people being diagnosed every year. What is diabetes? It's a metabolic disorder. What that means is that in diabetes, blood glucose metabolism is altered and disturbed. That also leads to disturbances in carbohydrate, fat, and protein metabolism. Diabetes is primarily due to defective insulin. That's either insulin secretion in the case of type 1 diabetes, or defective insulin action in the case of type 2 diabetes. Diabetes the word means to flow through. It was first observed and named by the Romans in around AD 70 when they noticed that people who were gluttonous, ate too much, drank too much, started to suffer from polydipsia, that's thirst, and then associated with that, polyuria, which is excess urination. So they were drinking and urinating in excess. Later, the British added mellitus, diabetes mellitus. They added the word mellitus, which means honey-like. And that was named after the British physicians noticed that the urine was sweet to the taste. In fact, that was one of the first diagnostic methods for diabetes. Now we have more sophisticated methods. Type 1 diabetes is also known as juvenile onset diabetes. This occurs in the young, typically, not always, but typically in the young. It is an autoimmune disease where insulin production is stopped because the pancreas is attacked by the immune system, eliminating the cells that produce insulin. People suffering from type 1 diabetes need to take insulin for life and are typically given an insulin pump. The damage associated with kind of disease is seen in the kidneys, the nervous system, and it can have very serious health consequences if glucose is not managed carefully. Here's a diagram showing type 1 diabetes. Insulin released from the pancreas. Pancreas is an organ near the liver. When glucose is detected in the stomach, the pancreas releases insulin to tell the body to store the glucose. If insulin is not present, to tell the body to store glucose or metabolize the glucose, then the glucose concentration rises in the blood, and high concentrations of glucose in the blood will cause a lot of damage. Type 2 diabetes, on the other hand, is a non-insulin dependent diabetes. It's sometimes called adult onset diabetes, represents 90 to 95% of all the cases of diabetes. There are genetic components to it, but lifestyle is the major factor that impacts onset of type 2 diabetes. In the case of type 2 diabetes, insulin is still produced by the pancreas, but the body becomes resistant to that insulin, in large part because fat cells no longer respond to the insulin that is present. That's due to an overabundance of fatty acids in the body. If type 2 diabetes is in your family, you are at much greater risk of type 2 diabetes yourself later in life. Here's a diagram showing what's going on with type 2 diabetes. When glucose is ingested and in the stomach, it starts to enter the bloodstream. The pancreas responds by producing insulin. However, glucose becomes trapped in the bloodstream because that insulin is not functioning correctly. It is unable to correctly signal to the fat cells and to the liver to store glucose or turn it into fat. So the glucose concentration remains high, and that high glucose concentration causes a lot of damage. Some clinical symptoms for diabetes. Increased urination, that's polyuria. Excessive thirst, that's polydipsia. There's typically increased hunger, which is called polyphagia. Lack of energy, irritability, blurred vision, sometimes unusual weight loss. And typically frequent infections because the immune system is one of the first systems that is damaged by high glucose levels. And then alongside of those frequent infections, you get slow healing of sores or cuts. Again, that's because the immune system is failing to function correctly. So how do you manage your risk? There are certain things that we cannot change. Age and ethnicity, family history, genetic history, and some other biological factors. These are things that we cannot easily modify. They can't modify them. However, there are a lot of things we can do to modify our risk for type 2 diabetes. The first of which is to manage our body weight. Obesity is one of the key drivers for diabetes. It's not the only one, but it is an important contributor to type 2 diabetes. Dietary choices make a huge difference for the onset of type 2 diabetes. You should choose a diet that is low in added sugars, no more than 200 calories a day from added sugars. If you're on a 2,000 kilocalorie per day diet, which is an average person. Levels of physical activity dramatically affect your risk for type 2 diabetes. Exercising regularly will stave off type 2 diabetes. Getting sufficient sleep, reducing stress, these are all factors that can help reduce your risk of type 2 diabetes. Prediabetes is when blood glucose is elevated but yet not high enough to be diagnosed as frank type 2 diabetes. You can see with elevated blood glucose the same sorts of symptoms as diabetes, but it is a time in which to be very cautious and start to change your diet and exercise habits. Let's take a look at the actual levels that are used for diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. Normal blood glucose is a concentration of 99 milligrams per deciliter of glucose or below. At rest, typically that's taken first thing in the morning before eating. That can be diagnosed by taking a simple drop of blood and measuring it with a simple glucose meter. Prediabetes would be where your resting blood glucose is in the 100 to 125 milligram per deciliter range, and then frank diabetes would be early morning glucose above 126 milligrams per deciliter. Now, if your doctor sees your blood glucose is elevated, perhaps pre-diabetic, or you have a frankly diabetic blood glucose measurement in the morning, they may send you to get an OGTT test, which is an oral glucose tolerance test. Here, the doctor will give you a bolus dose, a large dose of glucose in the form of a drink. You'll drink this volume of fluid with a high concentration of glucose. And then they will look to see what happens to your blood glucose levels over the next 2 to 3 hours. For most people, blood glucose is rapidly processed and stored and drops below 139 milligrams per deciliter. If you're pre-diabetic, it'll be under 200 milligrams per deciliter. And if you're frankly diabetic, blood glucose levels will skyrocket and be above 200 milligrams per deciliter. One further way to look for blood glucose is to look at some of the damage that is occurring. And one of the signs of damage that is occurring is a protein found on red blood cells called hemoglobin A1c. Hemoglobin A1c is a modified form of hemoglobin that can be measured in the blood. The damage occurs over the course of about 1 month because red blood cells last about 1 month before they are recycled. So hemoglobin A1c is a measure of how high your blood glucose levels have been over the last month. If your blood glucose is below 5.7, your A1c levels are below 5.7%, then that means your blood glucose is kept in a healthy range. If it's 5.7 to 6.4%, then that is a pre-diabetic stage. And above 6.5, that means glucose is modifying too much of your hemoglobin. Glucose is damaging those red blood cells, and alongside of that damage, it will be also damaging your white blood cells and your immune system. It will start to damage your nervous system. It may damage the blood vessels in your retina and impact vision. So that's a danger sign, and that's when you will need to be treated for type 2 diabetes. Some complications of diabetes. If your blood glucose gets out of control, you can end up in a diabetic coma. One of the most common consequences of type 2 diabetes is cardiovascular disease. The glucose in your blood damages your blood vessels, causing the formation of fatty plaques around those sites of damage. That causes heart attacks and strokes. So one of the most common features of diabetes is cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, and strokes. Many people with diabetes will die of cardiovascular disease. Damage also occurs in the kidneys. Many diabetics can end up with loss of kidney function and kidney failure. Typical and horrible side effect from diabetes is infections in limbs and eventual amputation through infections and gangrene and the need to remove those limbs. Eye disease, loss of vision, common in diabetes. Increased risk of infectious disease because your immune system is not functioning correctly, and gum and tooth disease is also seen. Here are some examples of the morbidity, the illness associated with type 2 diabetes. You can see retinopathy, where blood vessels in the eye have become damaged, and basically that's a mini stroke in the blood vessels in the eye, bleeding into the back of the retina, which will result in loss of vision. There can be macrovascular blocks. You can see the leg at the top has the veins have been blocked by that damage I was talking about that's occurring inside the blood vessels. Those fatty plaques, those hard fatty plaques that can block the blood vessels. Blood cannot pump through the leg properly. It gets stuck, and you end up with this massive swelling and inflammation. There can be foot ulceration here in the bottom right, where an infection has occurred because the foot, the nervous system in the foot is no longer functioning properly, and the person probably didn't feel that infection getting going. Not only that, the immune system is not functioning correctly to clear the infection, and so bacteria has gained hold in that wound and caused damage. Further damage occurs. You can see loss of limbs, like here, loss of a gangrenous large big toe. So how is diabetes mellitus treated nutritionally speaking, many different things have been tried. Early on, many physicians thought, probably as most of you think, that the simplest thing to do would be to remove all carbohydrates from the diet of a person suffering from type 2 diabetes. And that was really what was first attempted back in the 1930s and in 1950s. You can see back in the 1930s, the percentage of calories coming from carbohydrates were around 14%. That increased in 1955 up to about 35% of calories. A drastic reduction in the carbohydrates in a person's diet. Unfortunately, what happens is that the calories that are missing are replaced. And when those calories are replaced, typically people eat high-fat foods to replace the calories that are missing. And those high-fat diets accelerate that damage process that I was talking about before. You've got high blood glucose causing damage to the vasculature throughout the blood vessels throughout the body. You've got the formation of fatty plaques that have started in the diabetic, and now you're giving those fatty plaques a lot of fat. They become full, they cause blockages, they cause heart attacks, they cause strokes. And it was discovered early on that reducing a person's carbohydrate intake was in fact dangerous for type 2 diabetics. And in fact, the ideal carbohydrate intake is in the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, the AMDR, for carbohydrates, which is between 45 and 65% of your diet should come from carbohydrates. Those carbohydrates should be made up primarily of complex carbs, at least 50% complex carbohydrates. And saturated fats need to be reduced in a diabetic's diet to under 7% of total calories. 10%, but better, under 7% total calories. The other thing that is very helpful for somebody that has type 2 diabetes is to remove simple sugars. That means monosaccharides and disaccharides. Added sugars is the place where sugars need to be removed from a diabetic's diet. Some fruit is absolutely fine in a diabetic diet, but reducing simple added sugars, anything like cookies or anything with sugar added cakes, ice creams, anything like that should be reduced dramatically in a type 2 diabetic diet. So how are you going to do that? Again, the same process for weight loss, for diabetes, and for cardiovascular disease. You need to eat all the vitamins and minerals. There is no point in becoming deficient in a vitamin or mineral. This will make you sick rapidly. You need to balance your macronutrients. That means eat 50% carbs, around 25% protein, around 25% fats in your diet. You need carbohydrates, you need fats, and you need proteins to have a balanced diet and to stay healthy. Kilocalorie control is really important if you are overweight, suffering from obesity, or diabetes secondary to obesity, or cardiovascular disease secondary to obesity. If you're suffering from obesity, that means a body mass index greater than 25, then you need to reduce your caloric intake every day. Keep your diet balanced, keep your diet adequate, but reduce calorie intake by around 500 kilocalories per day to allow weight loss of about a pound per week. You don't want to lose weight faster than that because that tends to result in rebound eating. Unless you're in a very controlled situation. Sometimes there are doctors' diets that have larger energy control. Variety is essential for all diets, but particularly essential for somebody that is suffering from type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease. Variety allows you to get all the vitamins and minerals. Eating a variety of fruits and vegetables and whole grains is really, really essential. Moderation is important. It is important to eat a diet that is low in solid fats, preferably under about 7% of solid fats or saturated fats. It should be low in added sugars. Look on products to be sure that they don't have sugar added to them. Find that most bread has a lot of sugar added to it. Many cereals have a lot of sugar added to them. Be very careful to select foods which have low in added sugar. And it is really important to eat foods that are low in salt. Many people are very salt sensitive and they will have high blood pressure. High blood pressure is a terrible combination with diabetes and cardiovascular disease and can result in strokes and heart attacks. So reduce the salt in your diet dramatically. And lastly, but by no means not important, is exercise. Exercise is one of the most important things you can do for any of these conditions. Any amount of exercise, whether that's walking around the block, jogging around the block, doing some weight training in the gym, anything like that, even body weight exercises, anything you can do at all will help. This is looking at medical nutrition therapy for diabetes. Ideally, maintain a weight with a body mass index less than 25. Ideally, eat carbohydrates in that 50 to 60% range. Mostly taking those carbohydrates from whole grains, legumes, and vegetables. Moderate simple sugars, mono and disaccharides. Eat high fiber foods. Increase your fiber intake up to about 50 grams of fiber per day. Moderate your protein intakes. Keep them in that 10 to 15% range to keep some of the pressure off your kidneys, because the damage from diabetes can damage kidneys. So you want to reduce the stress on your kidneys by not eating too much protein. Keep total fat under 30%, which is the acceptable macronutrient distribution range for fats, but particularly keep saturated fats under 7%. Monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats are perfectly healthy in a well-balanced diet for a person with diabetes or cardiovascular disease. And it is important to keep cholesterol low. If your cholesterol is high, your doctor may suggest you take statins. Statins are extremely effective to reduce cholesterol and to reduce cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, and strokes. And most importantly, exercise 90 to 150 minutes per week at a minimum. Prevention of diabetes. Studies have shown that loss of body mass, perhaps 5% or up to 7% of your current body weight through regular physical activity, sometimes that's just changing body composition, will lower the risk of progressing from pre-diabetes to frank diabetes. Try to adopt a healthy diet. Many people like a Mediterranean diet. That works quite well, but there are many other ways of making your diet healthy. Try to increase physical activity, and there are some medications, some surgeries that can be used to prevent diabetes.